The Supreme Court just delivered a bombshell ruling that sent shockwaves through Westminster and left Keir Starmer's government scrambling for answers. Behind closed doors, a secret scheme was unfolding. One that would fundamentally alter Britain's relationship with the European Union without your consent. But 24 hours ago, Britain's highest court stepped in and tore the whole plan apart. The political establishment is in meltdown mode. The Prime Minister is facing calls for his resignation, and millions of Britons are waking up to a betrayal they never saw coming. This isn't just another political scandal. This is about the very sovereignty you voted for, the democracy you believed in, and the future that's being stolen right from under your nose. What the Supreme Court uncovered will make your blood boil, and what happens next could determine whether Britain remains a truly independent nation or becomes a puppet dancing to Brussels' tune. Buckle up, because what you're about to discover has been deliberately hidden from you, and the powers that be never wanted this day to come. The ruling came down at precisely 9:47 yesterday morning, and within minutes, the entire political landscape of the United Kingdom had shifted on its axis. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision that left no room for ambiguity, declared that the Starmer government's attempt to reintegrate Britain into key European Union regulatory frameworks was not only legally questionable, but fundamentally unconstitutional. Lord Justice Pemberton, reading the judgment in a courtroom packed with journalists and legal observers, stated in terms that couldn't be clearer: the government had attempted to bypass parliamentary sovereignty, circumvent the will of the British people, and essentially surrender legislative power to foreign bodies without proper democratic consent. The words hung in the air like a death sentence for Starmer's administration, and the implications began spreading through the corridors of power faster than wildfire through dry timber. For months, whispers had circulated in Westminster about something called the European Regulatory Alignment Framework, a bureaucratic term so bland and technical that most people's eyes would glaze over at the mere mention of it. And that was precisely the point. This wasn't some grand treaty signing with flags and ceremonies. This was regulatory creep, the slow and silent surrender of British sovereignty through the back door while everyone was distracted by cost of living crises, NHS waiting lists, and the daily circus of political theatre. The framework, as the Supreme Court documents now reveal, would have bound Britain to automatically adopt hundreds of EU regulations across sectors ranging from financial services to environmental standards, from digital markets to food safety. Britain would have had no vote, no veto, no voice, just an obligation to implement whatever Brussels decided. It was Brexit in reverse, accomplished not through a referendum or even a proper parliamentary debate, but through ministerial orders and statutory instruments that most MPs wouldn't even read before they became law. The architect of this scheme, as documents submitted to the Supreme Court demonstrate, was none other than David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, working in concert with European Commission officials in a series of meetings that were never disclosed to Parliament. Between March and August of this year, Lammy held no fewer than 17 private meetings with EU representatives, including 3 with the Commission President herself. The minutes of these meetings, obtained through a Freedom of Information request that the government fought tooth and nail to suppress, make for absolutely chilling reading. In one exchange from June, Lammy is recorded as saying that the Brexit referendum result was a temporary aberration that needed to be managed carefully until public opinion could be properly educated. Properly educated! Let that sink in. The Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, a man entrusted with representing British interests on the world stage, was describing the democratic decision of 17.4 million voters as something that needed to be corrected through manipulation and misdirection. This wasn't diplomacy, this was contempt for democracy itself, dressed up in the language of progressive governance. But Lammy wasn't working alone, and this wasn't some rogue operation. The Supreme Court judgment makes crystal clear that the European Regulatory Alignment Framework had the full backing of Number 10. Keir Starmer himself attended at least 5 of the key negotiating sessions, including a pivotal meeting in Brussels on the 14th of July, where the basic structure of the agreement was finalised. The Prime Minister, who had promised during the election campaign that he would make Brexit work and respect the referendum result, was simultaneously working to dismantle the very foundations of British independence. The documents show that Starmer personally approved the strategy of implementing the framework through secondary legislation rather than primary bills, specifically because it would attract less scrutiny and could be rushed through while Parliament was focused on other matters. This was calculated deception on a scale that would make even the most cynical political operators blush with shame. The man who stood before the British people and promised integrity, honesty and transparent government was orchestrating the greatest betrayal of democratic will in modern British history. The legal challenge that ultimately brought this house of cards crashing down came from an unlikely source, not from the Conservative opposition, not from Reform UK, not from any political party at all, but from a coalition of constitutional lawyers, trade unions and grassroots campaign groups who had been monitoring the government's regulatory activities. The lead claimant was Professor Margaret Chen, a constitutional law expert from Cambridge University, who noticed peculiarities in a series of statutory instruments published in late September. These instruments, buried in hundreds of pages of technical jargon, contained clauses that would have automatically incorporated future EU directives into British law without requiring any further parliamentary approval. It was the legal equivalent of signing a blank cheque and handing it to a foreign power. Professor Chen raised the alarm, and within days, a legal team had assembled to challenge the government in court. What they uncovered during the discovery process was far worse than anyone had imagined. A comprehensive plan to effectively rejoin the European Union in all but name, implemented through regulatory alignment that would make British law subservient to European decisions for decades to come. The government's defence strategy in court was as revealing as the scheme itself. Rather than denying the facts, which were by that point undeniable, government lawyers argued that the executive had inherent authority to enter into international regulatory arrangements in the national interest, and that parliamentary sovereignty could be exercised after the fact through retrospective approval. It was a breathtaking argument, essentially claiming that the government could commit Britain to binding international obligations first and ask Parliament's permission later. Lord Justice Pemberton demolished this reasoning with withering precision, pointing out that such a doctrine would render parliamentary sovereignty meaningless and reduce the legislature to a rubber stamp for executive overreach. The judgment noted that if the government's arguments were accepted, future administrations could sign away any aspect of British independence and simply present Parliament with a fait accompli. It was, the court ruled, fundamentally incompatible with centuries of constitutional tradition and the basic principles of representative democracy. The government had not just overstepped its authority, it had attempted to rewrite the constitutional settlement itself without anyone noticing. The public reaction to yesterday's Supreme Court ruling has been nothing short of explosive, and the political fallout is still unfolding in real time. Within hours of the judgment being published, protests erupted outside Parliament, with crowds that swelled throughout the day until, by evening, tens of thousands of people had gathered in Westminster demanding answers, accountability and the Prime Minister's immediate resignation. These weren't the usual organised political demonstrations with printed banners and coordinated chants. This was genuine popular fury, spontaneous and raw. People who had voted for Brexit back in 2016, who had been told their decision would be respected, who had watched years of parliamentary gridlock and political chaos only to finally achieve what they thought was a settled outcome, suddenly discovered that their government had been working secretly to undo everything they'd fought for. The sense of betrayal cuts across traditional political lines. Lifelong Labour voters who had backed Brexit feel deceived by a party they trusted. Conservative supporters are demanding to know why their own party's opposition was so ineffective that this scheme got as far as it did. Even people who voted Remain in the original referendum are horrified by the undemocratic nature of what Starmer and Lammy attempted. Because if a government can secretly reverse one referendum result, no democratic decision is ever truly safe. The media coverage has been relentless and unforgiving, even from outlets that would normally give a Labour government the benefit of the doubt. The front pages this morning told the story in stark terms. Democracy betrayed, Starmer's secret deal, the Brexit reversal you were never meant to know about. The broadcast media, initially cautious in their coverage as they tried to verify the details, have now fully grasped the magnitude of the story. Political editors who've seen decades of scandals and controversies are calling this one of the most serious constitutional crises in modern British history. What makes it particularly damaging for the government is that there's no room for spin or interpretation. The Supreme Court judgment lays out the facts in painstaking detail, and those facts are damning. No amount of media management or clever communication strategy can change what the government actually did or the contempt for democracy that it represents. Every interview, every statement, every attempt to defend the indefensible just makes the situation worse for Starmer and his team. The Prime Minister's press conference yesterday afternoon was a masterclass in evasion and obfuscation, but the journalists weren't having any of it, pressing him repeatedly on why he thought he had the right to make such fundamental decisions about Britain's future without consulting the people or their elected representatives. Inside the Labour Party itself, the reaction has been one of shock, anger and rapidly developing panic. Backbench MPs, many of whom represent Leave voting constituencies, are facing fury from their constituents and demanding explanations from the leadership that aren't forthcoming. Several MPs have already publicly called for Starmer to resign, and rumours are circulating that a formal leadership challenge could be mounted within days. The party's left wing, never fully reconciled to Starmer's leadership, sees this as vindication of their long-standing suspicions that he was never truly committed to respecting the Brexit referendum. The party's right wing, which had backed Starmer as a safe pair of hands who could make Labour electable again, now realises they've been sold a false bill of goods. Cabinet ministers are scrambling to distance themselves from the scheme, with several claiming they knew nothing about the European regulatory alignment framework until they read about it in the Supreme Court judgment. Whether these claims of ignorance are true or simply self-preservation instincts kicking in doesn't really matter. Either way, they paint a picture of government that's either conspiratorially secretive or incompetently disorganised, and neither option is a good look. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, who has carefully cultivated an image of economic competence and fiscal responsibility, is reportedly furious that Starmer's political recklessness has now overshadowed her entire economic agenda and potentially destabilised the very market confidence she's been working to build. The opposition parties, predictably, are circling like sharks around wounded prey. Rishi Sunak, speaking in Parliament during yesterday's emergency session, delivered perhaps the most effective speech of his political career, methodically laying out the timeline of deception and demanding not just resignations, but a full public inquiry into how this scheme was developed and who authorised it at every stage. His performance was all the more effective because he avoided partisan bombast and instead adopted the tone of a disappointed headmaster dealing with students who'd fundamentally betrayed trust. Nigel Farage, leading the Reform UK charge, was less restrained, calling for immediate general elections and describing the Supreme Court ruling as proof that the British political establishment, Labour and Conservative alike, has never accepted the result of the Brexit referendum and has been working continuously to overturn it by any means necessary. His argument resonates because there's now documentary evidence to support it, at least in Labour's case. The Liberal Democrats, who have always been openly pro-European and pro-Remain, find themselves in the awkward position of agreeing with the policy goals of what Starmer attempted, while having to condemn the undemocratic methods used to pursue those goals. Their leader's statement yesterday tried to thread this needle, but ended up satisfying nobody, appearing to simultaneously defend closer EU ties while criticising the government's approach in terms so mild as to seem like a gentle suggestion rather than serious opposition. The international dimension of this crisis is particularly fascinating and problematic. The European Union itself is maintaining official silence, with Commission spokespersons declining to comment on what they describe as internal British political matters. But off the record, briefings from Brussels tell a different story, one of frustration that a scheme they thought was progressing smoothly has now been exposed and scuttled, and concern that this debacle will make any future British government even more reluctant to pursue closer regulatory alignment. Some European officials are privately blaming Starmer for moving too quickly and too secretly, arguing that a more gradual and transparent approach might have been more successful. Others see this as confirmation that Britain will always be an unreliable partner, too politically unstable and too divided over European questions to ever properly engage with EU frameworks again. The French government, which has always taken the hardest line on post-Brexit relations, is reportedly seeing this as vindication of their tough approach. Why offer Britain special arrangements or compromises when British governments can't even be trusted to honour agreements made in secret, let alone those made publicly? The German government, traditionally more conciliatory toward Britain, is said to be reassessing whether there's any point in maintaining the various informal cooperation channels that have been established over the past few years. The diplomatic damage may take years to repair, assuming anyone even wants to make the effort. The financial markets, meanwhile, have responded with volatility that reflects deep uncertainty about British political stability. The pound dropped sharply when news of the Supreme Court ruling first broke, recovered slightly as the full details became clear, then dropped again, and as the scale of the political crisis became apparent. Currency traders aren't worried about the specific regulations that won't now be implemented. They're worried about a government that appears to be imploding, about political chaos that could paralyse decision-making for months, and about the possibility of snap elections that could produce an even more unstable outcome than the current situation. Bond markets have also reacted nervously, with yields on British government debt rising as investors demand higher returns to compensate for increased political risk. The Bank of England, which had been carefully managing monetary policy to support economic recovery while controlling inflation, now faces a much more complicated environment where market volatility driven by political factors threatens to undermine their carefully calibrated approach. Business leaders, already frustrated by years of Brexit-related uncertainty followed by the disruptive policy changes of the new Labour government, are expressing exasperation that just when things seem to be settling down, a new political crisis has emerged to make planning and investment decisions even more difficult. The CBI and other business groups are calling for calm and stability, but their statements have a distinctly desperate quality, as if they know their pleas will fall on deaf ears in the current fevered atmosphere. The constitutional implications of the Supreme Court's ruling extend far beyond the immediate political drama and into fundamental questions about how Britain is governed and what limits exist on executive power. The judgment, running to over 200 pages of dense legal reasoning, establishes several principles that will shape British constitutional law for generations. First, and most important, is the reaffirmation that parliamentary sovereignty cannot be circumvented through regulatory backdoors or executive agreements that create binding obligations without explicit parliamentary approval. The court made clear that while the government has legitimate authority to conduct international negotiations and enter into certain types of agreements, any arrangement that would effectively transfer legislative power or bind Britain to automatically adopt rules made by foreign bodies requires full parliamentary scrutiny and explicit statutory authorisation. This isn't a new principle, it's been fundamental to British constitutional theory for centuries, but the court's emphatic restatement in the face of government arguments that would have substantially weakened it represents a crucial bulwark against executive overreach. Legal scholars are describing the judgment as one of the most important constitutional cases since the Gina Miller Brexit litigation, precisely because it draws clear lines about what governments can and cannot do in the name of international cooperation. The second major constitutional principle, reinforced by the ruling, concerns the role of referendums in the British system. Britain doesn't have a formal written constitution that specifies exactly how referendum results must be treated, and there's been long-standing academic debate about whether referendums are merely advisory or whether they create binding political obligations that cannot be reversed without going back to the people. The Supreme Court's judgment doesn't resolve this debate entirely. It explicitly states that it's ruling on the legal and procedural defects in how the government acted, not on the political wisdom or legitimacy of the policy itself, but the reasoning, throughout the judgment repeatedly emphasises that the 2016 Brexit referendum represented a fundamental democratic decision that gave a specific mandate to withdraw from the European Union and its regulatory structures. The court notes that whatever one thinks about whether that decision was wise, it was made through a legitimate democratic process after extensive public debate, and any government seeking to substantially reverse or undermine that decision has an obligation to be transparent about what it's doing and to seek fresh democratic consent. By attempting to reintegrate Britain into EU regulatory frameworks through opaque technical processes rather than open political debate, the government was effectively treating the referendum result as something to be managed and circumvented rather than respected. The judgment doesn't quite say that governments are permanently bound by referendum results. Constitutional flexibility requires that democratic decisions can be revisited, but it makes absolutely clear that doing so requires honesty, transparency and proper process, not secret schemes and regulatory subterfuge. The third dimension of constitutional significance involves the balance of power between government and parliament, a question that has become increasingly fraught in recent decades as executives have accumulated more power and parliamentary scrutiny has often seemed ineffective. The Starmer government's defence rested significantly on the argument that extensive use of secondary legislation and ministerial powers is a standard and necessary feature of modern governance. Given the complexity of regulatory systems and the need for executive flexibility, there's truth to this. Parliament couldn't possibly debate every technical regulation in detail, and some degree of executive discretion is inevitable. But the Supreme Court's judgment draws a crucial distinction between using executive power to implement policies that Parliament has already approved in principle versus using executive power to make fundamental constitutional decisions that would permanently alter the relationship between Britain and foreign political entities. The framework that Starmer and Lammy were constructing fell decisively into the latter category. Yet they were attempting to implement it through mechanisms designed for the former. The judgment is particularly scathing about the government's deliberate strategy of fragmenting the framework across dozens of different statutory instruments so that no single parliamentary debate would reveal the overall scheme. This wasn't just poor practice, it was, the court suggested, a calculated attempt to deceive Parliament about what was being done in its name. Future governments will now find it much harder to use similar tactics, knowing that courts will look at the substance of what's being done rather than just the formal legal procedures being followed. Beyond the immediate legal principles, the Supreme Court ruling has reignited broader debates about Britain's place in the world and what kind of relationship the country should have with its European neighbours. These debates never really went away after Brexit, of course. They've been simmering continuously since 2016. But they've been somewhat muted in recent years as the practical reality of post-Brexit Britain has settled in. And people have focused on making the new arrangements work rather than constantly relitigating old battles. The revelation of Starmer's secret scheme has blown the lid off that uneasy truce and brought all the old divisions roaring back to the surface. Pro-Brexit voices are arguing that the Supreme Court case proves what they've been saying all along, that the British establishment never accepted the referendum result and has been continuously working to reverse it by stealth. They point to the European regulatory alignment framework as evidence that given any opportunity, pro-European politicians will try to drag Britain back into EU structures, regardless of what voters actually want. This vindication of their suspicion, backed by hard evidence rather than just speculation, has energised the Leave coalition and given them powerful ammunition in the ongoing battle over Britain's international orientation. They're demanding not just accountability for what Starmer attempted, but also safeguards to prevent any future government from trying something similar, perhaps even including a constitutional requirement that any significant movement toward closer EU integration must be approved by referendum. Pro-European voices, meanwhile, are in a more difficult position, forced to condemn the methods Starmer used while still defending the underlying goal of closer regulatory alignment with the EU.